The sun hung low over Dodge City like a copper penny against the dusty Kansas sky, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that lined Front Street. The air carried the familiar sense of horse sweat, leather, and whiskey that marked every frontier town worth its salt. Cole Morrison guided his tired bay mare toward the hitching post outside the Lucky Dollar Saloon, the animal's hooves clicking against the hard-packed earth with the steady rhythm of a man who had traveled far and expected to travel farther still. Morrison dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose bones remembered too many hard rides and harder fights. His coat, once black, had faded to the color of old ash, and dust from 100 miles of prairie had settled into every crease and fold. The stranger stood just under 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of strength beneath the worn fabric, but his posture carried the slight stoop of a man well past his prime. Gray whiskers covered his weathered face like frost on winter ground, and his pale blue eyes held the distant look of someone who had seen too much and forgotten too little. Before you find out what happens to this mysterious stranger, I'm curious where you're watching from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're in. There's something about these old Western tales that seems to cross every border, and I love seeing how far these stories of justice and reckoning travel. Now, let me tell you about a man whose past was about to catch up with him in ways nobody expected. The stranger tied his reins to the post with practiced efficiency, his scarred hands moving with the automatic precision of decades spent on the trail. Each finger bore the white lines of old cuts, and his knuckles carried the permanent swelling that came from too many fights won and lost. He pulled a worn leather satchel from his saddlebags, checked that his mare had access to the water trough, then turned toward the saloon doors with the unhurried gait of a man who had learned patience in hard schools. Inside the Lucky Dollar, conversation flowed as freely as the whiskey, accompanied by the familiar sounds of frontier nightlife. Cards slapped against green felt, coins clinked into growing pots, and somewhere in the back corner a fiddle played a melancholy tune that spoke of homes left behind and dreams that never quite came true. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the sweet smell of spilled beer, while oil lamps cast dancing shadows across faces that had seen their share of trouble. Morrison pushed through the batwing doors and surveyed the room with the automatic caution of a man who had walked into too many situations that turned deadly without warning. The barkeep, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and forearms like tree trunks, looked up from the glass he was polishing and nodded toward the newcomer. Most of the tables were occupied by the usual mix of cowboys, drifters, and local merchants, their conversations creating a low hum that filled the spaces between the fiddle notes. The stranger chose a corner table where he could sit with his back to the wall and keep an eye on both the front door and the back exit. It was the kind of seat selection that spoke of experience earned in places where survival depended on seeing trouble before it saw you. He settled into the chair with a soft grunt, removed his hat to reveal silver hair that had once been dark as midnight, and placed the worn felt carefully on the table beside him. Tom Bradley, the barkeep, had worked the Lucky Dollar for 15 years and prided himself on reading men the way some folks read newspapers. This stranger carried himself different from the usual drifters who wandered through Dodge City. Something about the way his eyes swept the room, cataloging faces and exit routes, suggested depths that went beyond simple caution. Bradley approached the table with a clean glass and a bottle of decent whiskey, the kind reserved for customers who looked like they could afford to pay their tab. "You want something to cut the trail dust, mister," Bradley said, setting the glass down with practiced care. Morrison nodded and gestured toward the bottle, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of a man who had spent years shouting orders over gunfire and wind. "Just whiskey," he replied, his tone polite but distant. "Make it a double." As Bradley poured, he noticed details that told stories the stranger probably didn't intend to share. The man's coat hung open enough to reveal the worn handles of twin pistols, their grips smooth from years of handling. The leather of his gun belt had been oiled and cared for with the devotion of someone whose life might depend on quick access to those weapons. Most telling of all were his hands, crossed casually on the table, bearing scars that spoke of violence survived and lessons learned in the hardest possible ways. Morrison lifted the glass and took a measured sip, his pale eyes continuing their steady survey of the room. He noted the card game in progress near the bar, the two cowboys arguing quietly over a woman who had long since left town, and the table of rough-looking men near the window who had been watching him since he walked in. These last drew his particular attention, not because they looked especially dangerous, but because danger often wore familiar faces in frontier towns where the law was whatever the strongest man said it was. The group by the window consisted of 7 men, and their leader was obvious from the way the others deferred to his opinions and waited for his approval before speaking. Black Jack Molina had earned his nickname not from his hair, which was the color of dried straw, but from his reputation for dealing from marked decks and leaving his opponents face down in whatever dirt was handy. He wore his gun low and tied down like someone who had practiced the quick draw enough to believe his own reputation, and his smile held the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed watching others squirm. "Look what the cat dragged in," Molina said loud enough for half the saloon to hear, his voice carrying the mocking tone that bullies used when they sensed weakness. His companions, a collection of drifters and failed cowboys who had found it easier to take what they wanted than work for it, turned their attention to the corner table where the stranger sat quietly drinking his whiskey. One of them, a thin man with nervous eyes and tobacco-stained teeth, laughed a little too loudly at his leader's observation. Morrison continued drinking as if he hadn't heard the comment, his weathered face showing no more reaction than if someone had mentioned the weather. This apparent indifference only encouraged Molina, who had built his reputation on intimidating men who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. He pushed back from his table and stood, his boots loud against the wooden floor as he approached the stranger's corner. "Friend, you look like you've been riding hard," Molina said, stopping just close enough to crowd the older man's space without quite touching him. His voice carried false concern wrapped around genuine malice, the tone of a predator playing with wounded prey. Morrison looked up slowly, his pale eyes meeting Molina's gaze without flinching or looking away. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tight, while the rest of the saloon began to take notice of the developing confrontation. "Just passing through," Morrison replied, his voice carrying no challenge but no submission either. He took another sip of his whiskey and returned his attention to the glass, as if the conversation was over and Molina had already been dismissed. This casual dismissal hit the gunman like a slap across the face, turning his false friendliness into something harder and more dangerous. The fiddle player in the back corner had stopped playing, and conversations throughout the saloon began to die as patrons recognized the particular tension that preceded violence. Tom Bradley continued polishing glasses behind the bar, but his movements had become mechanical, his attention focused entirely on the drama unfolding in his establishment. He had seen enough frontier confrontations to know when words were about to give way to gunplay, and everything about this situation felt like a fuse burning down toward an explosion. Molina's patience for subtle intimidation lasted exactly as long as it took him to realize the old man wasn't going to cower like most folks did when faced with 7 armed men and a reputation for violence. The gunman's jaw worked around a plug of tobacco, building up the brown juice that had become his signature calling card in towns from here to Colorado. With deliberate ceremony, he leaned forward and spat a thick stream that splattered across the toe of Morrison's right boot, the dark stain spreading across the worn leather like spilled blood. The gang erupted in appreciative laughter, slapping tables and each other as if their leader had just performed the finest entertainment this side of a traveling circus. Charlie Briggs, a scarred man with dead eyes and hands that shook unless he kept them busy with violence, nearly fell off his chair in his enthusiasm. "That's showing him, Jack," Briggs wheezed between gasps of laughter. "Old-timer probably ain't had his boots cleaned in years anyway." Morrison looked down at his stained boot with the detached interest of a man examining something mildly curious but ultimately unimportant. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a faded red bandana, the fabric soft from years of use and careful washing. With movements as deliberate as a preacher reading scripture, he bent forward and began wiping the tobacco juice from his boot, taking care to clean every trace of the brown stain from the cracked leather. When he finished, Morrison folded the bandana carefully and returned it to his pocket before lifting his pale blue eyes to meet Molina's gaze directly. "That was disrespectful, son," he said, his voice carrying no more heat than if he was commenting on the weather, but something in those winter-cold eyes suggested depths that went beyond simple annoyance. The words fell into the sudden quiet like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread throughout the saloon. Molina's grin widened, revealing teeth stained yellow from tobacco and neglect. Disrespectful, he repeated, drawing out the syllables as if savoring the taste. Well, ain't that something, boys? The old buzzard thinks we owe him an apology. His companions took this as their cue to escalate the entertainment, rising from their chairs and spreading out in a loose semicircle around Morrison's table like wolves surrounding a wounded deer. Ezra Pike, the youngest of the gang at barely 22, but already carrying knife scars across his knuckles that spoke of a violent apprenticeship, stepped close enough to Morrison's chair to invade the older man's space completely. Without warning, Pike's hand shot out and shoved Morrison's shoulder hard enough to rock him in his seat, the sudden motion causing whiskey to slosh over the rim of his glass and puddle on the scarred wooden table. "Easy there, Grandpa," Pike sneered, his voice cracking slightly with the excitement of someone still young enough to find cruelty amusing. "You look about ready to tip over and break a hip. Maybe you should be home in your rocking chair instead of trying to drink with real men." The gang's laughter grew louder and more pointed, feeding off each other's energy like a fire consuming dry timber. Morrison absorbed the shove without complaint, using his bandana again to carefully wipe the spilled whiskey from the table surface before setting his glass down with the precision of a man who had learned to control his temper through years of hard experience. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, counting out exact change for his drink and placing the coins on the table with deliberate care. The stranger stood slowly, his movements carrying the careful stiffness of someone whose joints had been broken and healed more times than most men could survive. He reached for his hat, brushing dust from the crown before settling it on his silver hair with the practiced motion of a man preparing to leave without causing further trouble. The simple act of preparation seemed to deflate some of the gang's excitement, as if they had expected more resistance to their escalating harassment. "Where you going, old man?" Molina demanded, his voice rising enough to carry clearly across the now silent saloon. The gunman stepped directly into Morrison's path, close enough that the stranger would have to push past him to reach the door. Molina's hand rested casually on his pistol grip, a gesture designed to remind everyone present exactly who held the power in this particular situation. Morrison stopped just short of collision, his pale eyes studying Molina's face with the dispassionate attention of a man cataloging details he might need later. "I believe I'm done here," he replied, his tone carrying no challenge but also no fear. "Sometimes a man knows when it's time to move on, and that time has come for me." He made no attempt to push past the gunman, but neither did he step back or show any intention of returning to his seat. The standoff stretched between them like a held breath, while patrons throughout the Lucky Dollar began to shift nervously in their chairs or edge toward exits they hoped wouldn't be blocked when the shooting started. Tom Bradley had stopped all pretense of working, his hands frozen on a half-polished glass as he watched the confrontation unfold in his establishment with the sick fascination of a man watching his livelihood potentially go up in smoke. That's when Martha stepped into the situation with the kind of courage that frontier women developed out of necessity rather than choice. She had been serving drinks at the Lucky Dollar for 3 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident and left her with bills to pay and no other marketable skills except the ability to smile at drunken men while avoiding their wandering hands. Martha was 26 years old, with auburn hair that caught lamplight like copper wire and green eyes that had learned to read trouble before it fully developed. "Gentlemen, please," Martha said, approaching the confrontation with a tray balanced in her hands and determination written across her features. "There's no need for this kind of trouble. The stranger hasn't done anything to deserve such treatment, and I'm sure he'd be happy to buy you all a drink and settle this peacefully." Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone who had defused countless bar fights through a combination of diplomacy and genuine concern for everyone involved. Molina turned toward her with the lazy attention of a cat noticing a mouse, his smile taking on an ugly edge that transformed his face from merely cruel to genuinely dangerous. "Well now," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that made several patrons reach instinctively for weapons they hoped they wouldn't need to use. Looks like the old fool's got himself a defender. Maybe Martha here thinks she's sweet on decrepit old-timers who can't hold their liquor or their tongues. Before Martha could respond, Pike's hand lashed out in a vicious backhand that caught her across the cheek with enough force to send her stumbling backward, her tray clattering to the floor as glasses shattered around her feet. The sharp crack of flesh against flesh cut through the saloon's tense atmosphere like a gunshot, followed immediately by Martha's sharp cry of pain and surprise as she pressed her hand to her reddening cheek. The sound of that slap changed everything in the Lucky Dollar saloon, as if someone had suddenly opened all the windows and let winter into the room. Morrison's entire posture shifted in the space between one heartbeat and the next, his shoulders squaring and his head lifting with the fluid motion of a man shedding a disguise he had worn too long. The pale blue eyes that had seemed distant and tired now focused on Molina with the intensity of winter stars, cold and bright and absolutely merciless. "You just made a mistake," Morrison said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. The words fell like stones into deep water, creating ripples of recognition among the older patrons who remembered when men like Morrison had been more common in towns like Dodge City. There was something in that quiet tone, a certainty that spoke of consequences delivered with the precision of mathematics and the finality of graveyards. Molina's laughter came out forced and brittle, like breaking glass trying to hold together. "7 guns against one old man," he announced to his gang, his voice slightly higher than it had been moments before. "I like the odds, boys. Don't know what this decrepit fool thinks he's going to do against all of us, but I reckon we're about to find out just how tough he really is under all that gray hair and tough talk." Morrison began removing his coat with movements so deliberate they seemed choreographed, each motion economical and purposeful as he folded the garment and placed it carefully on his vacated chair. As the coat came away, it revealed a sight that sent whispers of recognition through the watching crowd and caused at least 3 men to quietly slide their chairs back from nearby tables to give themselves room to move if shooting started. The twin Colt Peacemakers rode in holsters that had been crafted by someone who understood both leather working and the needs of men whose lives depended on quick access to their weapons. The gun belt itself was a work of art, tooled with patterns that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when such things mattered, and the holsters were positioned with the precise angles that allowed for the fastest possible draw. But it was the grips of the pistols themselves that carried the real story, carved from ivory and bearing initials that had been inlaid with silver wire in a script too elegant for frontier gun work. "Those antiques supposed to scare us?" Molina demanded, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence as he stared at weapons that were clearly anything but decorative. The Colts showed the honest wear of tools that had been used regularly and maintained with religious devotion, their metal surfaces bearing the particular patina that came only from years of careful handling by someone who knew their value extended far beyond mere monetary worth. In the back corner of the saloon, Deputy Marshal William Hayes felt his blood turn to ice water as recognition hit him like a physical blow. Hayes was 24 years old and had been wearing a badge for exactly 6 months, but he had grown up listening to stories about legendary lawmen who had tamed the frontier during its bloodiest years. Those matched Colts, with their distinctive ivory grips and silver-inlaid initials, were as famous in certain circles as the man who had carried them through a dozen of the West's most dangerous towns. Hayes's face went white as prairie alkali as he stared at the weapons that had become legend, knowing with sick certainty that Black Jack Molina and his gang had just picked a fight with a man whose reputation had been built on the graves of men who had made similar mistakes. Deputy Hayes stood so abruptly that his chair toppled backward, the wooden legs clattering against the floor with enough noise to draw every eye in the saloon toward his corner table. The young lawman's face had gone the color of old parchment, his hand trembling as he pointed toward the weapons now visible at Morrison's hip. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the absolute silence that had fallen over the Lucky Dollar, every word carried with perfect clarity. "Those are Reaper's guns," Hayes breathed, his eyes fixed on the ivory grips with their distinctive silver inlay work. The carved initials YM caught the lamplight like stars against winter sky, and Hayes could make out the delicate script that spelled out a woman's name with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of deep love and careful devotion. Ellen Morrison, he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer offered in a church built from violence and legend. Molina's confident grin faltered for the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty creeping into his expression like shadows advancing across open ground. The gunman glanced between Hayes and Morrison, trying to process information that didn't fit with his assessment of the situation. "Reaper's been dead 20 years, he said, but his voice carried less conviction than it had moments before, as if he was trying to convince himself rather than anyone else. Morrison's pale blue eyes shifted toward the young deputy, studying Hayes with the careful attention of a man evaluating whether someone represented threat or ally. The stranger's weathered face showed no emotion, but something in his posture suggested he was weighing decisions that would determine whether this confrontation ended in words or gunfire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had learned that the most dangerous threats were delivered in whispers rather than shouts. "Reaper never died," Morrison said, each word falling into the silence like stones dropped into a deep well. "Just got tired of killing." His right hand moved with casual precision to rest on the ivory grip of his pistol, the gesture so natural it seemed unconscious, but Hayes recognized it as the automatic positioning of someone whose survival had depended on quick access to his weapons for far too many years. Hayes swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he tried to find words adequate to explain the magnitude of what Molina and his gang had stumbled into. The deputy had grown up on stories about the legendary federal marshals who had brought law to the frontier's most dangerous territories, but Cole Morrison had occupied a special place in those tales, a figure whose reputation had transcended normal law enforcement to become something approaching myth. "That's Cole Morrison," Hayes said, his voice gaining strength as professional training began to override personal awe. "They called him the Reaper of Dodge City, but he cleaned up half the territories from here to California." The deputy's eyes never left Morrison's face, searching for confirmation of what his recognition of those famous weapons had already told him. "Tombstone, Abilene, Deadwood," he continued, listing towns where Morrison's intervention had turned the tide against organized lawlessness. Morrison nodded slowly, acknowledging the accuracy of Hayes's identification without showing either pride or shame in the recitation of his past accomplishments. The stranger's expression remained as neutral as weathered granite, but his eyes held depths that spoke of memories carried like scars through decades of trying to forget what duty had once required him to become. 43 men, Morrison said, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone reciting statistics that held personal meaning beyond their numerical value. All justified, all necessary. Every one of them chosen violence over law, and every one of them discovered that choice had consequences that couldn't be avoided or appealed. His hand remained resting casually on his pistol grip, the ivory smooth and warm from years of handling by fingers that had learned their deadly lessons in the hardest schools imaginable. Hayes found himself nodding involuntarily as Morrison spoke, the young deputy's knowledge of frontier law enforcement filling in details that the stranger hadn't bothered to mention. Cole Morrison had been appointed federal marshal at 28, younger than any man before him, but he had brought order to territories where previous lawmen had lasted weeks rather than years. His methods had been direct and final, earning him respect from honest citizens and fear from those who preferred to operate outside the boundaries of civilization. He trained some of the best lawmen this country ever saw, Hayes continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his professional footing in the face of legend made flesh. Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett, Bass Reeves, they all learned from Cole Morrison. The stories say he could outdraw and outshoot any man alive, but more than that, he could outthink them. Always knew what they were going to do before they did it themselves. Morrison's weathered features softened slightly, as if Hayes's words had touched something that still carried warmth despite years of attempted burial. "Teaching was always more satisfying than killing," Morrison replied, his tone carrying the first hint of humanity that had emerged since the confrontation began. Young men with badges needed to understand that speed with a gun was less important than knowing when and why to draw it in the first place. Molina and his gang had been listening to this exchange with the growing horror of men who had just discovered they had inadvertently kicked a sleeping grizzly bear. Charlie Briggs was now visibly sweating despite the cool evening air, his nervous hands making unconscious movements toward his weapon before jerking away, as if the pistol had suddenly become too hot to touch. Ezra Pike's earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by the wide-eyed expression of someone calculating odds that had turned decidedly unfavorable. The gunman leader found his voice, but it came out rougher than before, carrying the strain of someone trying to maintain authority in a situation that had spun beyond his control. "That's just old stories," Molina said, but even he seemed unconvinced by his own words. "Men get famous for things they never really did. Half the stories about frontier lawmen are nothing but campfire tales made bigger with every telling." Morrison turned his full attention to Molina for the first time since Hayes had identified him, and the intensity of that pale blue gaze was like having winter suddenly enter the room. "Look at my hands, boy," Morrison said, lifting both hands so the lamplight could clearly illuminate the network of scars that covered his knuckles and palms like a map of violence survived and lessons learned. "Count the scars if you think they're just stories. Each one was bought with blood, and most of it wasn't mine." The stranger's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the tone of someone who had long since stopped caring whether others believed him because the truth would reveal itself soon enough regardless of anyone's opinion. Morrison had spent 15 years trying to forget the skills that had made him legendary, but some knowledge was carved too deeply into muscle and bone to ever completely disappear. "I retired 15 years ago," Morrison continued, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone remembering a different life. "After I buried my wife Ellen, I thought I was done with violence. Thought I could just drift from place to place, maybe find some peace in towns where nobody knew who I used to be." His eyes moved to Martha, who was still holding her reddening cheek, and something cold and final settled into his expression. "But some things don't stay buried," Morrison said, his stance beginning to change in subtle ways that Hayes recognized from stories about how the legendary marshal had looked in the moments before violence became inevitable. "Some things have a way of calling a man back to what he was, whether he wants to answer that call or not." The temperature in the Lucky Dollar seemed to drop several degrees as Morrison's transformation from tired drifter to deadly predator continued with the inexorable certainty of sunrise. Molina's gang began exchanging glances that spoke of men suddenly understanding they had made a potentially fatal error in judgment. The comfortable numerical superiority they had enjoyed moments earlier now felt less like an advantage and more like a responsibility they weren't certain they wanted to bear. Pike's hand moved unconsciously toward the exit, as if his body was already preparing for retreat while his mind struggled to accept what his eyes were telling him about the man they had chosen to torment. Morrison stepped away from his corner table with the fluid grace of a man whose body remembered lessons learned when every movement could mean the difference between drawing another breath or drawing flies. The transformation that had been building throughout the confrontation reached completion as he moved into the center of the Lucky Dollar's main floor, positioning himself where every angle of the room fell under his direct observation and control. The legendary marshal's hands hung loosely at his sides, fingers relaxed but ready, displaying the deceptive casualness of a master craftsman approaching familiar work. His pale blue eyes swept the saloon with mechanical precision, cataloging exit routes, potential cover positions, and the exact placement of every person who might become either obstacle or ally in the violence that now seemed inevitable as winter following autumn. "I'm giving you one chance," Morrison said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had delivered similar ultimatums to countless others over the years. The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into a deep well, each syllable weighted with the certainty of consequences that could not be avoided or appealed. Every patron in the Lucky Dollar understood they were witnessing the kind of moment that would be discussed in whispers for years to come. "Walk out those doors," Morrison continued, inclining his head slightly toward the Batwing entrance without taking his eyes off Molina and his gang. "Ride hard. Never come back to Dodge City. Find yourselves honest work in some place where nobody knows your faces or your reputation." His tone carried no anger, no personal animosity, only the professional detachment of someone offering terms that represented the only alternative to violence. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, while Molina's gang exchanged glances that spoke of men suddenly forced to confront the gap between their comfortable brutality and genuine danger. Charlie Briggs had begun sweating profusely, dark stains spreading under his arms despite the cooling evening air. Ezra Pike's earlier swagger had vanished completely, replaced by the expression of someone discovering that actions carried consequences beyond his ability to imagine or control. For a moment that stretched like eternity, it seemed as if wisdom might prevail over pride, that 7 men might choose survival over the face-saving violence that had destroyed so many others in frontier towns where reputation mattered more than longevity. Deputy Hayes held his breath, hoping against experience that this confrontation might end with words rather than gunfire, that the legend standing before them might complete his business without adding to the tally that had made him famous. Then Molina's pride reasserted itself with the destructive force of a flash flood in a narrow canyon, washing away whatever chance existed for peaceful resolution. The gunman's hand dropped toward his weapon with the desperate speed of someone who had finally recognized the magnitude of his miscalculation but chose to compound it rather than admit error before his followers and the watching crowd. 7 guns against 2, Molina declared as his fingers wrapped around his pistol grip, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of maintaining leadership when everything in his survival instincts screamed for retreat. I like our odds, boys. Don't matter who this old man used to be, he's still just 1 gun against all of us. The words came out rushed and brittle, like someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Morrison's response came with the inexorable certainty of mathematics made manifest in flesh and bone. His right hand moved toward his weapon with a motion so economical it seemed almost casual, but the ivory-gripped Colt appeared in his fingers with the supernatural speed that had become legend among those who survived encounters with frontier justice. The draw was not flashy or dramatic, just professionally perfect, executed with the muscle memory of someone who had practiced the movement until it became as natural as breathing. The first shot echoed through the Lucky Dollar like thunder in a closed canyon, followed immediately by Molina's scream of pain and surprise as his weapon exploded from his grip in a shower of metal fragments and blood. Morrison's bullet had struck the gunman's pistol at the precise point where the cylinder met the frame, destroying the weapon while simultaneously opening Molina's gun hand to the bone without causing permanent crippling damage. Before the echo of that first shot had faded, Morrison's left hand had drawn his second Colt with the same fluid precision, the weapon appearing as if summoned by will rather than retrieved by conventional means. The second shot followed the first so closely they seemed almost simultaneous, and Charlie Briggs found himself staring at empty air where his drawn pistol had been moments before, the weapon spinning away across the floor in pieces while his thumbs spurted blood from a perfectly placed graze that had severed nothing vital but rendered his gun hand temporarily useless. The remaining 5 gang members scattered like quail flushed by a hunting dog, diving behind overturned tables and scrambling for whatever cover the saloon's furnishings could provide. Chairs flew through the air as men desperate to avoid Morrison's attention sought shelter that offered more psychological comfort than actual protection from bullets that seemed to find their targets with supernatural accuracy. Morrison stood calmly in the center of the chaos, both Colts now drawn and held with the relaxed competence of someone whose weapons were extensions of his will rather than separate tools requiring conscious manipulation. His voice cut through the confusion like a blade through silk, carrying clearly to every corner of the room despite speaking barely above conversational volume. 5 left, Morrison announced, beginning to walk slowly toward the scattered gang members with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world and knew exactly how he intended to use it. The ivory grips of his pistols caught the lamplight as he moved, and every person in the Lucky Dollar understood they were witnessing the kind of gunfighting artistry that had passed into legend but had never truly disappeared. Ezra Pike made the mistake of raising his head above the table edge to assess his situation, providing Morrison with the target he needed to demonstrate that speed was less important than precision when applied by someone who understood both concepts intimately. The third shot took Pike's hat cleanly from his head, the bullet passing so close to his scalp that he could feel the heat of its passage, but causing no injury beyond the permanent reminder that his life had just been spared by choice rather than chance. "You boys picked the wrong profession," Morrison observed, continuing his methodical advance, while keeping track of every gang member's position with the tactical awareness that had made him legendary among lawmen who worked territories where survival depended on seeing around corners and through walls. His tone carried no satisfaction, no pleasure in the dominance he was demonstrating, only the weary certainty of someone who had performed this particular dance too many times to find novelty in its steps. The fourth and fifth shots came in rapid succession as two gang members tried to coordinate an attack from opposite sides of the room, their timing destroyed by Morrison's ability to anticipate movement before it began. Neither bullet drew blood, but both men found themselves disarmed and cowering as their weapons were shot from their hands with the same surgical precision that had defeated their companions. Morrison paused to reload both weapons with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed, his fingers handling cartridges and cylinders with the automatic efficiency of someone who had performed this operation under fire countless times. The sound of fresh rounds sliding into chambers carried clearly through the silence, a mechanical rhythm that spoke of preparation for whatever resistance might still be offered. Three men remained armed and mobile, but their position had become untenable as Morrison demonstrated complete control over the battlefield they had chosen. The legendary marshal had positioned himself to command every angle, cutting off access to exits while maintaining clear lines of sight to any position that might offer concealment to his remaining opponents. Tom Bradley crouched behind his bar, clutching a shotgun he had never expected to need, watching in awe as a living legend dismantled 7 armed men with the methodical efficiency of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. The barkeeper had seen gunfights before, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the clinical precision with which Morrison was demonstrating why his reputation had survived 15 years of retirement. The remaining gang members huddled behind inadequate cover, their earlier confidence replaced by the dawning realization that they were facing someone whose skills operated on a level beyond their comprehension or ability to counter. The numerical advantage they had counted on had proven meaningless against expertise that treated multiple opponents as merely an organizational problem requiring systematic solution. Martha watched from beside the wall where she had taken shelter, her injured cheek forgotten in the face of witnessing justice delivered with the precision of divine intervention. The violence unfolding before her held none of the chaotic brutality she had seen in typical saloon fights, but rather the controlled application of skill in service of a moral certainty that left no room for doubt or mercy for those who had chosen to prey upon the innocent. Morrison's voice cut through the tension once more, offering terms that every surviving gang member understood represented their final opportunity to walk away from this encounter with their lives intact. The choice he was offering had been made simple by his demonstration that resistance would be met with consequences they lacked the skill to survive or avoid. Morrison stood over the disarmed gang members like a judge presiding over a court where the verdict had already been rendered by superior firepower and unassailable moral authority. The ivory-gripped Colts remained steady in his weathered hands, their barrels tracking the slightest movement among the 7 men who now understood with crystal clarity that their lives hung by threads no thicker than the legendary marshal's patience. The silence that filled the lucky dollar carried weight beyond mere absence of sound, pregnant with the kind of tension that preceded either mercy or execution in frontier towns, where justice moved swiftly and appeals were heard only by whatever deity men chose to petition in their final moments. Morrison's pale blue eyes swept across the faces of men who had learned too late that reputation and reality were entirely different creatures when encountered in the flesh. "You spat on my boot," Morrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone whose words had once carried the force of federal law across territories where survival depended on understanding exactly what those words meant. The statement hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, simple in its construction, but weighted with implications that every person in the saloon understood without need for elaboration or explanation. Molina clutched his shattered gun hand against his chest, blood seeping between his fingers as he stared up at the man whose reputation he had dismissed as campfire mythology only minutes before. The gunman's face had gone the color of old parchment, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air that drifted through the Lucky Dollar's open windows and doors. But more importantly, Morrison continued, his gaze shifting to Martha where she stood against the wall still holding her reddening cheek. "You struck an innocent woman. That action crossed lines that had nothing to do with personal offense and everything to do with the kind of moral boundaries that separated civilization from chaos in places where the law was whatever the strongest man said it was." The legendary marshal's attention returned to Molina with the focused intensity of a hawk studying prey, but beneath that predatory assessment lay something deeper and more dangerous than simple anger. Morrison had spent too many years watching men like Molina terrorize people who couldn't defend themselves, and that experience had burned away any tolerance he might once have possessed for cruelty directed at the vulnerable. "You're going to apologize to the lady," Morrison said, his tone suggesting that this was not a request subject to negotiation or delay. "You're going to tend to her injuries personally, and you're going to do it with the respect due to someone whose only crime was trying to prevent violence in a situation where violence was the only language you seemed to understand." The words carried the weight of absolute certainty, as if Morrison was describing events that had already occurred rather than making demands about future behavior. Molina struggled to his feet with obvious difficulty, his injured hand making balance challenging while his remaining gang members watched from their positions behind overturned furniture with the expression of men who understood they were witnessing the complete dismantling of everything they had thought they knew about power and intimidation. The gunman's earlier swagger had vanished completely, replaced by the careful movements of someone who finally comprehended the magnitude of his miscalculation. "I'm sorry, miss," Molina mumbled, his voice barely audible as he approached Martha with the hesitant steps of someone expecting to be shot for moving without permission. The apology came out cracked and uncertain, lacking any conviction but carrying the desperate sincerity of a man who understood that his life depended on performing contrition convincingly enough to satisfy someone whose mercy was not guaranteed. Martha accepted the apology with the grace that frontier women learned to display when surviving required swallowing pride and accepting whatever justice was available rather than demanding perfect satisfaction. She allowed Molina to examine her cheek and pronounced that no permanent damage had been done, though the red mark would serve as a reminder of his violence for days to come. Morrison watched this interaction with the careful attention of someone ensuring that justice was not only served, but seen to be served by everyone present in the Lucky Dollar. When Molina had finished his ministrations, Morrison gestured toward the destruction that the brief gunfight had caused to Tom Bradley's establishment, indicating furniture that would need repair and glassware that would need replacement. "Your gang will repair every piece of damage caused here tonight," Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the saloon. "You'll pay for new glasses, new chairs, whatever it takes to restore this place to exactly the condition it was in before you decided to make trouble for folks who were minding their own business." The terms were delivered with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, brooking no argument or appeal. Deputy Hayes had been watching this entire proceeding with the fascination of someone witnessing legend made manifest, but professional duty finally overcame personal awe as he remembered his responsibilities as a law enforcement officer. The young deputy approached Morrison's position with careful deference, his badge catching lamplight as he moved. "Marshal Morrison," Hayes said, using the title that Morrison had officially abandoned 15 years earlier, but which still seemed to fit him like a familiar coat. "I've got wanted posters on these men in my office. They've been terrorizing small towns from here to Colorado, taking whatever they wanted and leaving honest folks too frightened to resist or report their crimes to authorities who might be too far away to help." Morrison's expression shifted slightly, taking on the professional interest of someone whose instincts for law enforcement had never truly died despite years of attempting to bury them beneath the quiet life of a drifting nobody. "Tell me about their crimes," Morrison said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to gathering information that would determine whether mercy or justice would be the order of the day. Hayes pulled a collection of yellowed papers from his vest pocket, unfolding them to reveal faces that matched the men cowering behind inadequate cover throughout the Lucky Dollar. They robbed the bank in Silver Creek last month, Hayes reported, his voice gaining confidence as professional duty provided structure for the awe that had been threatening to overwhelm his ability to function. $3,000, and they killed a clerk who tried to stop them. Before that, they burned out a family of homesteaders near Pueblo, took everything they owned, and left them to starve. The litany of crimes continued as Hayes recounted a pattern of violence and theft that painted Molina's gang not as simple troublemakers, but as genuine predators who had chosen to survive by preying on those too weak or isolated to defend themselves effectively. Morrison listened with the grim attention of someone who had heard similar recitations too many times over the years, each crime adding weight to decisions that would determine how this confrontation ultimately resolved. When Hayes finished his report, Morrison surveyed the gang members with the calculating gaze of someone weighing guilt against potential for redemption and finding the scales tipped heavily toward permanent solutions. $3,000 represented enough money to feed dozens of families through harsh winters, while the murdered bank clerk had been someone's son, husband, or father whose life had been snuffed out for the convenience of men who preferred taking to working. The reward money will be split among their victims, Morrison announced, his voice carrying the ring of absolute authority as he imposed justice according to principles that transcended mere legal technicalities. Every dollar these men stole will be returned to the people who earned it through honest labor, and the families they've hurt will receive compensation from whatever wealth these thieves accumulated through violence and intimidation. Morrison gestured for Molina to approach, the movement casual but carrying unmistakable command that brooked no hesitation or delay. The injured gunman complied with obvious reluctance, his wounded hand pressed against his chest, while his remaining fingers trembled with either pain or fear, or some combination of both emotions that reflected his complete understanding of how thoroughly his situation had deteriorated. "You have a choice, son," Morrison said, his voice taking on the tone of someone offering final terms that would not be repeated or revised. "You can take your men and ride out of this territory tonight. Keep riding until you reach country where nobody knows your faces or your reputation. Find honest work, settle down. Become the kind of men your mothers hoped you'd grow up to be when they first held you as babies." The alternative remained unspoken but clearly understood by everyone present in the Lucky Dollar, hanging in the air like the scent of gunpowder that still drifted through the saloon's atmosphere. Morrison had demonstrated his capability and willingness to deliver permanent solutions to problems that couldn't be resolved through words or warnings, and everyone understood that his patience had limits that prudent men would not test. Molina nodded frantically, his earlier bravado completely extinguished by the demonstration of what genuine skill looked like when applied by someone who understood the difference between intimidation and actual danger. "I understand, Marshal," the gunman whispered, using the title that Morrison had never formally relinquished even if he had stopped wearing the badge that went with it. "We'll leave tonight and never come back. You have my word on that." Morrison studied Molina's face for signs of deception or hidden defiance, his pale blue eyes searching for any indication that this promise would prove as worthless as the gunman's earlier swagger and threats. After a moment that felt like hours to everyone involved, Morrison nodded slowly and holstered his weapons with movements that somehow seemed more threatening than their earlier display had been. "Your word better be worth more than your judgment," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose threats were never empty and whose memory for faces never failed. "I'll be tracking reports from this territory, and if I hear about 7 men matching your descriptions causing trouble for honest folks, I'll come looking for you. And when I find you, we won't be having another conversation about choices and opportunities." The gang members began gathering their scattered weapons and belongings with the desperate haste of men who understood they had been granted mercy they had neither earned nor deserved, and who were determined not to provide any excuse for that mercy to be reconsidered or withdrawn. Within minutes, the Lucky Dollar emptied of everyone except Morrison, Martha, Deputy Hayes, Tom Bradley, and a handful of local patrons who remained to witness the conclusion of events they would be discussing for years to come. Tom Bradley emerged from behind his bar carrying a bottle of his finest whiskey, the kind he reserved for special occasions and customers whose money was guaranteed to be good. "Marshall, your money's no good in my establishment," Bradley said, approaching Morrison with the deference due to someone whose intervention had probably saved lives and definitely preserved property. "Any man who stands up for decent folks the way you just did drinks for free as long as I'm drawing breath." Morrison accepted the offered whiskey with the grace of someone who understood the importance of allowing others to express gratitude in whatever ways were available to them. "Just coal now," he corrected gently, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had tried to leave his legendary past behind but found it following him like a shadow that couldn't be outrun. "The badge is buried with my wife, and I'd prefer to keep it that way if circumstances allow." Morrison returned to his corner table with the same measured pace that had characterized his movements throughout the confrontation, settling into his chair as if the past hour had been nothing more than a brief interruption to his evening drink. The ivory-gripped Colts disappeared beneath his coat with the same casual efficiency that had brought them into play, becoming invisible once again to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for and where to find it. The lucky dollar began to return to something approaching normal activity as patrons emerged from whatever cover they had sought during the brief but decisive gunfight. Though conversations remained muted, and every eye in the saloon continued to drift toward the corner where Legend sat quietly finishing whiskey that had somehow survived the chaos unspilled. Tom Bradley moved through his establishment assessing damage and beginning the process of restoration. But his movements carried the careful respect of someone who understood he was in the presence of frontier history made flesh. Martha approached Morrison's table with steps that spoke of gratitude mixed with the kind of awe that came from witnessing justice delivered with surgical precision by someone whose reputation had transcended normal law enforcement to become something approaching myth. The red mark on her cheek had begun to fade, but the memory of what Morrison had done on her behalf would remain vivid for the rest of her life. "Marshall Morrison," Martha said softly, her voice carrying the warmth that frontier women reserved for men who proved themselves worthy of respect through actions rather than words. "I wanted to thank you for what you did tonight. Not just for me, but for everyone in this town who's been afraid to speak up when men like that decided they could take whatever they wanted from decent folks." Morrison looked up from his glass with the tired smile of someone who had learned that gratitude was often the heaviest burden that heroes were asked to carry, weighing more than guilt or regret because it reminded them of responsibilities they had tried to abandon but could never completely escape. "Every woman deserves respect, ma'am," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the gentle courtesy that had been drilled into him by parents who believed that true strength revealed itself through protection of those who needed defending rather than domination of those too weak to resist. Martha's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, understanding instinctively that this man would be uncomfortable with emotional displays, but needing him to know that his intervention had meant more than simply stopping one evening's violence. "You gave me back my dignity tonight," she whispered, her words carrying the weight of someone who had learned to accept disrespect as the price of survival until witnessing what happened when someone with the power to enforce courtesy decided that such acceptance was no longer necessary. Morrison nodded acknowledgement of her thanks without claiming credit for actions that had flowed naturally from principles he had never consciously chosen to abandon despite years of attempting to live quietly and anonymously. "Some things are worth fighting for, Martha," he replied, his tone carrying the certainty of someone whose moral compass had been tested in situations where compromise meant innocent people suffered for the convenience of those who preferred taking to earning. Deputy Hayes approached the table with the careful deference of someone seeking wisdom from a master craftsman whose skills represented the pinnacle of professional excellence in fields where mistakes were measured in lives rather than mere inconvenience. The young lawman's badge caught lamplight as he moved, but his expression carried humility that spoke of someone who understood the difference between wearing authority and earning it through demonstrated competence under fire. "Marshall Morrison," Hayes began, his voice carrying respect that bordered on reverence, "I was wondering if you might share some advice for someone who's still learning what it means to wear a badge in country where the nearest help might be days away and the people, depending on you, deserve better protection than good intentions and a willingness to try hard." Morrison studied the young deputy's face with the careful attention of someone who had seen too many good men die because they mistook courage for competence and enthusiasm for experience. Teaching had always been more rewarding than killing, Morrison mused, echoing words he had spoken earlier, but investing them now with the weight of someone who understood that knowledge passed on was the only legacy that mattered more than the graves he had been forced to fill. The most important lesson any lawman can learn, Morrison continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing wisdom earned through trial and error in situations where error meant permanent consequences, is that being fast with a gun is less important than knowing when and why to draw it in the first place. Speed without judgment is just violence, and violence without justice is just murder wearing a badge. Hayes listened with the intensity of someone who understood he was receiving instruction that could determine whether he survived long enough to become the kind of lawman his community needed rather than simply another good man who died because he confused bravery with wisdom. The deputy's hand moved unconsciously to his weapon, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with carrying tools designed to deliver permanent solutions to temporary problems. Remember that every man you face was somebody's son, Morrison said, his pale blue eyes focusing on distances that existed only in memory and regret. Every trigger you pull echoes in ways you can't imagine when the moment demands action. Make sure that when those echoes reach you in the quiet hours before dawn, you can live with the sound they make in your conscience. The wisdom Morrison shared carried the weight of experience earned in places where moral certainties became complicated by circumstances that demanded split-second decisions with consequences that lasted lifetimes. Hayes absorbed every word with the hunger of someone who understood that survival in his chosen profession depended on learning from those who had walked similar paths and lived to share what they had discovered. Being right doesn't make you fast, Morrison continued, but being right makes you deadly in ways that speed can never match. When you know in your bones that what you're doing serves justice rather than pride or anger, your hand will be steady and your aim will be true because righteousness carries its own kind of power that doesn't depend on practice or natural talent. As the evening progressed toward the kind of late hour when frontier towns began preparing for sleep, other townspeople gathered the courage to approach Morrison's table and offer their own thanks for his intervention on behalf of community safety and dignity. Each expression of gratitude was met with the same quiet courtesy that characterized everything Morrison did. But beneath his gracious acceptance of their thanks lay the weariness of someone who had learned that being remembered as a protector meant never being allowed to forget the violence that protection sometimes required. Tom Bradley approached with a fresh bottle and the kind of smile that spoke of genuine warmth rather than mere business courtesy. "Marshal," the barkeeper said, his voice carrying the respect due to someone whose actions had probably saved his establishment from destruction and his customers from harm. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you like. Room and board on the house, and I'll make sure nobody bothers you with questions or requests for stories about the old days." Morrison appreciated the offer with the grace of someone who understood that hospitality represented the frontier's highest expression of gratitude, but his response carried the gentle firmness of someone whose nature demanded movement rather than settlement. "That's generous of you, Tom," Morrison replied, his voice carrying genuine warmth despite the refusal that everyone could sense approaching. "But I'm just passing through, like I always am. Some men are meant to build communities, and others are meant to keep moving so those communities can grow in peace." The refusal carried no offense, and Bradley accepted it with the understanding of someone who recognized that certain kinds of men were defined by their willingness to walk away from comfort in service of principles that couldn't be abandoned without abandoning everything that made them worth knowing. The barkeeper nodded and returned to his work, but his movements carried the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed something remarkable and would carry that memory as long as he drew breath. As sunset approached and the time for departure became unavoidable, Morrison rose from his table with the same deliberate movements that had characterized his presence throughout the evening. He placed his hat on his silver hair with the automatic precision of someone preparing for travel, checked that his weapons were properly secured, and gathered the few possessions that represented everything he owned in a world where permanence was illusion and the only certainty was the need to keep moving. Deputy Hayes called out as Morrison reached the Batwing doors, his voice carrying the mixture of hope and regret that came with watching legend prepare to fade back into the anonymity from which it had emerged. "Will we see you again, Marshal?" Hayes asked, the question carrying the weight of someone who understood that some encounters were destined to be singular rather than repeatable. Morrison paused at the threshold between the Lucky Dollar's lamplight and the gathering darkness of Front Street, his weathered profile silhouetted against the dying light like something carved from frontier mythology rather than flesh and blood. "Pray that you won't need to," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that his presence was always a symptom of circumstances that peaceful communities should never be forced to endure. The legendary marshal stepped into the evening air and walked toward his waiting horse with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned that destinations mattered less than the journey between them, and that peace was found not in places, but in the knowledge that duty had been fulfilled regardless of personal cost. Behind him, the Lucky Dollar returned to normal activity, but everyone present understood they had witnessed something that would be discussed and remembered for generations to come. Weeks passed, and Martha named her newborn son Cole after the man who had restored her dignity and showed her community what justice looked like when delivered by someone who understood the difference between violence and righteousness. Years followed, and children grew up hearing stories about the evening when legend walked into their town and reminded everyone that good men still existed in a world that sometimes seemed determined to reward only the cruel and selfish. Black Jack Molina's gang never recovered from their encounter with Cole Morrison, the remnants scattering to distant territories where they found honest work and spent their remaining years looking over their shoulders for a figure in a faded black coat who might emerge from any crowd to remind them that mercy was a gift that shouldn't be squandered through repeated stupidity. In a quiet cemetery outside a town whose name had been forgotten by everyone except the man buried there, fresh flowers appeared regularly on two graves that bore the names Cole and Ellen Morrison, left by grateful strangers who understood that some debts could never be fully repaid but should never be forgotten. The headstone bore simple words that captured everything important about the man who lay beneath prairie soil beside the woman whose memory had guided his conscience through decades of difficult decisions. The inscription read simply, "Cole Morrison, he chose peace, but never forgot justice." And those words served as both epitaph and philosophy for a man who had learned that true strength revealed itself not in the willingness to fight, but in the wisdom to know when fighting was the only option that honor would allow. If this story of justice and redemption touched your heart tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you tales of courage, honor, and the kind of men who stood tall when others chose to look away. These stories remind us that heroes aren't born from legend. They're forged in moments when doing what's right matters more than doing what's easy. Until next time, may you find the courage to stand for what's just, even when the cost seems too high to bear.